There's that inevitable point in every photographer's journey where you go from using the camera and starting to get really familiar with it, and then you just hit that roadblock where you now realize you have to learn how to post-process, and that can really make or break a lot of people. There is good news though, and the good news is that post-processing doesn't have to be complicated. There's a million tips and tricks out there that you can look at, but the majority of processing, as you'll see in this video here, is very simple. It's simply brightening and darkening in the right areas. So follow along, and I'm going to show you some of my workflow, how to get the most out of your raw files, and how to get some pretty solid results with minimal tools. So we have two different raw files here, and I'm going to show you pretty quickly how we can go from this to this. We've got this mountain image and then looking across with the layers over the fjord. Here I am in Camera Raw. This is part of Photoshop. If you use Lightroom, the layout is just about the same. Now, the main goal when I'm photographing, the composition is all about leading the eye to a certain point. Our processing is the same thing. Think of processing as your opportunity to really make sure the eye ends up at the point you want it to end up. In this image here with the mountain, the whole purpose of the image is this is the main subject. The mountain back here, it's reflected in the tarn. I want to make sure that people really enjoy looking at that mountain scene, looking at this frame. Obviously there's a lot of layers. I've got the trees, then the water, and then we flow on up this valley. I really want people to go on that visual journey and essentially end up in the distance back here. So what's the main way that we can get people to look at something? It's light. The eye is drawn to light. We are like moths to a flame. So let's do it. We're mainly going to brighten and darken. So with this image, the first thing I typically do, if you've seen my videos, you know that I like to use the landscape profile. Just gives the image a bit more punch straight away with the colors. It also adjusts the exposure ever so slightly. Just gives you a good head start. I'm going to open up the exposure panel now, and I've shot this as I have because I was trying to protect all these highlights out here. I didn't want to overexpose them, knowing that I've got good shadow recovery in my camera. I'm going to bring up the entire exposure now because I want every tone to be evenly brought up. It looks more realistic that way. Now that the sky is just starting to get a little bit bright, I'm going to bring the highlights down. Now when you do this, you need to keep in mind that you're not just removing highlights from up in your sky, you're removing highlights globally, meaning everywhere. And that's not always a good thing because foreground and reflections, etc., it looks good having some highlights on them because they're going to be subtle but create tonal separation and depth. So if I do a highlight recovery, I'm not going to go too hard on that. I'm going to bring that down to about there for now. The next thing I'll typically do in an image is raise the shadows. Now, if I go too heavy, it doesn't look realistic. You need to keep in mind darkness and light. The eye will flow from darkness towards light, as we mentioned. If we go too bright on that foreground, the eye will now remain at the foreground and not travel on to the distance. So if I do a shadow recovery, I'm going to go easy on it. Now for the fun part. The main tool that I use, the adjustment brush, we click the masking button and here it is here, brush, and the shortcut is K. So from now on, I'm going to push K to get the adjustment brush up, and I set the feather, flow and density to 100 on this brush, which makes it nice and soft on the edges. And when I click and apply my adjustment, it applies instantly. Now this brush is going to allow me to go in and locally in small zones apply whatever I need to apply. So I'd like to darken that sky down further. Why is that? Having that sky darker up the top is going to push the eye towards the center of the frame, which will remain brighter. I'm going to bring the exposure down. I'm going to guess what I need. I like to apply first instead of brushing first because that way I can watch in real time the result and you can intuitively run the brush along and apply it where you need. If you brush first and then make the adjustments, it's not very organic in my opinion. Now you'll notice here, I'll hover over the mask, I've left that right hand side. I've done that on purpose because that's where the sunlight's coming in. We want to keep that nice and bright. The next thing I'm going to do, I push K for a fresh brush. I'm going to raise the shadows and some of the blacks on everything in the distance. And that's what you call atmospheric perspective. It's happening right here. See the mountain in the background has no black in it. It's more like a gray. It's all washed out. As we progress closer, we get darker tones, and then eventually we end up right down here close to the viewer where we have absolute black happening in those shadows. atmospheric perspective, but we want to emphasize that. So I want to make sure that this mid zone, the midground, is a little bit lighter than our foreground, and that's just further emphasizing that perspective. That's how we create the further illusion of depth and three-dimensionality, even though we're looking at a two-dimensional photo here. So something like that. It just needs to be separate from the foreground dark tones. The next thing I might do, I'm pushing K for the adjustment brush again. I'm going to put some warm light from that right hand side. I'm going to bring the temperature up, and we might just lift the exposure slightly, and we're just going to run that along this right hand side here, like so. Lastly, I'm going to run down to the color panel. I might lift the vibrance up slightly like that. And you know what? Lucky last will probably be a touch darker globally. I'm just going to bring down the exposure like so. And I like referencing the histogram. That's showing me the data that I have in this file. Am I losing any? That small highlight clip is more than fine, and that's quite realistic to have, especially when you have that type of side light coming in. The other thing I sometimes will do, if I want to get more tonal separation and details out on something like trees, I'd lift the whites. So on the brush now, I've got a new brush. Lifting whites is just going to lift anything that has a little bit of light on it back there. And that instantly just gives it more depth. See that? But it's subtle. If you do exposure, it does every tone. So the whites, I might even do some whites and a small amount of shadows in the foreground here, just so we've got some more detail in the front, but again, not going too hard with that because we want to flow the eye towards that background. Before and after, that's where it was, that's where it's at. What did we do? You know, exposure, highlights and shadows, and then with our masking tools here, primarily using the adjustment brush, we made all those local adjustments. If I turn the local adjustments off, you can see what the brush allowed us to do. It allowed us to shift the attention from the sky back to the main subject in the middle there. Let's move on to our second image, and you'll see it's the same principle. We'll go back to full screen for you, bring that down. It's a little bit dark, so I'm going to raise up the entire exposure. I'm now going to, I'll change the landscape profile. And I want to make sure that we really zone in on that center area. So I think to do that, having a darker sky, going to decrease exposure, might even decrease the blacks, run that brush along up there. It's not only pushing the eye back to the center now, but it's just creating a little drama back there, which, hey, I'm a drama queen. I like a bit of drama in the images. This time we're going to bring the whites up and just hit that center area. Where do I want the eye to go? It's in this centralized zone. That's the whole point of the composition. So I'm flowing the eye into the center there. And look at that beautiful warm light that we're getting creeping in, that side light. I just love it. But I want to emphasize it. I want to make sure that other people can enjoy it. I'm going to bring the exposure up on the brush, and I'm going to rehaze. So that's going left on the dehaze, so rehazing. And that also creates a bit of an illusion of light. It's like diffuse light. Really all it is adjusting contrast and decreasing it, which, as I said, atmospheric perspective, it's making it look further away. So you can see the effect that that has, you know, just that haze light. We can warm it up partially as well if we wanted to. The last thing is maybe just some more whites and even highlights potentially just on these trees, just so they're not a flat mid-tone. We want to bring out those branch details in there, get some nice tonal separation. So even if we left it there, guys, before, after, so simple and quick. And we'll turn the local adjustments off. That's without the brushwork, and that's with the brushwork. Now, I'm not saying these are completely finished. They're probably 90% complete. My workflow now would be to save them, let them marinate, let them sit there. I'd have to come back with fresh eyes and make the final adjustments. But I hope that you can see how the processing doesn't have to be overcomplicated. Now, of course, every scene and every lighting scenario will provide, different approaches to the processing, but we do have two completely different images here, and you can see how simple the workflow is. So I hope that's going to help you on your photography journey when you're starting out. Like I said, this workflow can be applied here in Camera Raw, which is Photoshop, or you can use Lightroom as well. It's all the same tools darkness and light. Lead the eye from darkness towards the light. If you have any questions at all, please leave them in the comments and I'll always get back to you. Hope you enjoyed the video and you might enjoy the rest of the channel. I appreciate the support and I'll see you next week.